Carla had always believed in the beauty of simplicity. Growing up, she had learned that the true value of a person wasn't determined by the clothes they wore or the luxury they surrounded themselves with. She preferred the quiet comfort of a well-worn sweater and a pair of jeans over the latest designer dress. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate fine things. It was just that she had never needed them to feel complete. Tonight, however, Carla felt a strange sense of excitement as she walked through the grand entrance of the Opal Sands Hotel. It was a place she had only ever seen in magazines, elegant, pristine, and breathtakingly beautiful. She had been invited to an event by her husband, Daniel, who was a well-known entrepreneur, and it seemed like the perfect occasion to dress up and experience something new. Carla was dressed in a simple black dress, nothing too fancy, but elegant enough to blend in. Her hair was tied up in a neat bun, and she wore just a hint of makeup to bring out her natural features. It was a far cry from the extravagant gowns worn by the women around her, but it felt comfortable, like herself. As they approached the reception desk, Carla felt the eyes of the hotel staff on her. They were well-dressed, their uniforms crisp and polished. The receptionist greeted them warmly, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Carla feel as though she didn't belong. "Good evening," the receptionist said, her tone just a bit too sweet. "How may I assist you?" Carla smiled politely, but as she looked around at the high-end decor, the polished floors, the glittering chandeliers, she couldn't help but feel a little out of place. "We have a reservation under the name Reynolds," Daniel said, stepping forward. His presence was commanding, his voice confident, and the receptionist's demeanor shifted immediately. She quickly found their reservation, her attitude changing from distant to more attentive. "Right this way, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds," she said, now addressing Daniel with a smile. She led them toward the elevator, where the heavy doors opened to reveal a grand view of the city below. But as they walked toward the elevator, Carla couldn't help but notice the way some of the other guests glanced at her. The whispers, the stares. They weren't subtle, and it was clear they didn't see her as one of their own. A few women looked her up and down, eyes lingering on her simple dress and modest appearance, before turning their attention elsewhere. Carla felt a flush rise to her cheeks. When they finally reached the ballroom, Carla's worst fears seemed to come to life. The room was filled with impeccably dressed individuals, their designer outfits shining under the soft lighting. Carla felt like she had walked into a scene from a movie, one where she was the outsider, the woman who didn't belong. She could feel the eyes of others on her as they made their way toward the cocktail area. Whispers followed them, women in glittering dresses with sharp eyes sizing her up. It was as if the very air in the room was filled with judgment. As Daniel chatted with a few guests, Carla stood off to the side, feeling more and more uncomfortable. She wanted to enjoy the night, to feel like she was part of something beautiful, but the way people were looking at her made her feel small. And then, the worst moment came. A well-dressed man approached them, his face smiling but his eyes cold. He looked at Carla, then at Daniel, with a polite, almost bored expression. "Excuse me, sir," the man said to Daniel, "but I think there's been a mistake. Your wife's attire doesn't quite meet the standards of the event. We'll need to ask you both to move to a different section." Carla's heart sank as the words hit her. The humiliation was immediate. The man didn't even address her directly. Instead, his eyes remained on Daniel, speaking to him as if she wasn't even standing there. For a moment, Carla froze. She felt exposed, vulnerable. The whispers around them grew louder as people began to notice the exchange. She wanted to leave, to disappear into the background, but Daniel's grip on her hand tightened. He didn't let go. The man's words hung in the air, cold and cutting. Carla's heart raced, but before she could even react, Daniel stepped forward, his grip on her hand tightening in a way that made her feel both secure and conflicted. The well-dressed man who had made the comment waited for a response, clearly expecting a quick resolution, but Daniel didn't budge. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. The man looked up at him, and for the first time, there was a slight change in his expression, a flicker of confusion. "I'm sorry," Daniel continued, his eyes steady, "but I believe you have mistaken my wife for someone else." The man blinked, caught off guard by the calm confidence in Daniel's tone. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a certain standard for attire here," he repeated, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. Daniel gave a small smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I understand that. But the problem is, you don't know who she is." Carla glanced at Daniel, her confusion mounting. What was he doing? She could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, but Daniel's calm demeanor made her hesitate. She wanted to shrink away, but something about the way Daniel stood beside her made her feel like she didn't have to apologize for being herself. The man glanced back at Carla, taking in her simple dress, her modest shoes, and her understated makeup. He clearly didn't recognize her, but his uncertainty was evident. "I'm afraid, sir, that the dress code is strictly enforced, no exceptions." "Let me make this clear," Daniel said, stepping even closer, his voice lowering slightly but carrying a weight that made the room seem to hold its breath. "This is my wife, Carla Reynolds, and she is not here by mistake." The man's face shifted from confusion to discomfort. He had clearly underestimated the situation, and now, as he looked between Daniel and Carla, the weight of his mistake began to settle in. "Reynolds," he repeated, his voice faltering as he began to piece things together. "Yes," Daniel replied firmly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "Carla is one of the leading philanthropists in the country, having raised millions for children's education and health care. But that's not why she deserves respect. It's because she's a person of value, and it's time you remember that." Sophie's heart skipped a beat at Daniel's words. She had always known that her husband was successful, but hearing him speak about her like that, with such certainty and respect, was something she hadn't expected. She had spent so many years trying to fit into a world that judged her by her clothes, by her appearance, but now Daniel was showing her something different. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The man looked flustered now, clearly realizing his mistake. He opened his mouth to apologize, but before he could get the words out, Daniel held up a hand to stop him. "No need for apologies," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "But I think it's time you take a moment to reflect on how you treat people, regardless of what they're wearing." Sophie stood still, taking in the scene. She had never seen her husband so poised, so composed. He wasn't just defending her, he was teaching a lesson, not just to the man standing before them, but to everyone in the room who had been quietly watching the interaction unfold. The room, which had been filled with whispers and judgment moments ago, was now completely silent. Sophie felt the eyes of the crowd on her, but this time they weren't filled with ridicule. They were filled with curiosity, maybe even respect, and for the first time in a long while she felt powerful, as if her value wasn't tied to the clothes she wore, but to who she was as a person. Daniel turned back to her, his gaze softening as he gave her a small smile. "Shall we go inside?" he asked gently, his tone warmer now, inviting her to step forward, out of the spotlight and into the night. Sophie nodded, her chest swelling with a newfound sense of pride. She didn't need the approval of people who would never understand her. She had Daniel, and now she knew her worth. The night was hers to own, and no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, could take that away from her. As Daniel and Sophie made their way into the elegant ballroom, the air had shifted. The once judgmental glances from the other guests had been replaced by uncertainty. Sophie could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but this time it didn't bother her as it had before. She had always been an outsider in places like this, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was no longer invisible. The grand ballroom was filled with glistening chandeliers and polished floors that reflected the shimmering light from the elegantly dressed crowd. Sophisticated conversations filled the air, but Sophie's mind was elsewhere, still processing what had just transpired outside the hotel. Daniel, as calm and collected as ever, guided her to the bar. His hand was gentle on her back as he helped her settle into a seat. Sophie couldn't help but notice how different he seemed. He had always been confident, but there was something about the way he stood by her tonight that made her feel invincible. "What you did out there," Sophie began, her voice low, still trying to wrap her head around everything. "I don't know how to thank you. I didn't know you were, well, that kind of man. I mean, I knew you were successful, but—" Daniel looked at her, his expression softening as he placed a hand on hers. "You're my wife, Sophie. You've always been a part of everything I've built, even if it doesn't seem like it. You deserve to be treated with respect, not because of who I am, but because of who you are." Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat, the words feeling heavier than she anticipated. She had always doubted herself in situations like this, always felt out of place when surrounded by wealth, status, and designer labels. But tonight, for the first time, she felt as though she belonged. "Do you know how many times I've walked into places like this and felt invisible?" Sophie asked, her voice shaky. "Like I was being judged by my clothes or my appearance. I never thought I'd be the one standing here with you tonight." Daniel gave her a reassuring smile, the kind that made her feel like she could conquer the world. "Well, I'm glad you're here now, and so is everyone else in this room. They just don't know it yet." Sophie's brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could ask what he meant, Daniel stood up, taking her hand. "Come with me. There's someone I want you to meet." Without giving her a chance to protest, he gently led her through the crowd, his presence commanding attention as they moved. People whispered as they passed, some surprised by the sight of them together, others intrigued by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. At the far end of the room, they stopped in front of a small group of well-dressed individuals. Sophie recognized a few of the faces, prominent philanthropists, investors, and people from high society. They all looked up as Daniel approached, their expressions changing as they took in the sight of him, then Sophie. "Sophie," Daniel began, his voice steady, "I'd like you to meet some of my colleagues." The group greeted them warmly, though there was a subtle shift in the way they looked at Sophie now. She could see it, the recognition, the respect. It wasn't about her dress or her outward appearance anymore. They were seeing her for who she was. A woman in a striking red gown smiled at Sophie, her eyes warm with curiosity. "So, Sophie," she said, "what do you do? We don't see many people like you at events like this." Sophie smiled, feeling the weight of the question but also the opportunity it presented. "I'm involved in a number of charitable projects," she replied, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I focus on education and healthcare for underprivileged children. I've worked with Daniel for years on various initiatives." The woman's eyes widened in genuine interest. "I didn't know that," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "I think it's wonderful what you're doing." Sophie felt a sense of pride swell within her, but she didn't let it show too much. It wasn't about impressing anyone here. It was about finally stepping into her own and being proud of the work she did, not because of the recognition, but because of its impact. Daniel gave her an approving glance, his hand lightly resting on her back as they mingled with the group. The conversation shifted, but the air was different now. No one was looking past Sophie. No one was judging her appearance. Instead, they were listening to her, interested in what she had to say. As the night went on, the lesson she had learned earlier in the evening began to sink in deeper. It wasn't about the labels or the clothes you wore. It was about what you had to offer, what you stood for, and the impact you made. And as she stood beside Daniel, she realized that no matter where she was or who she was with, she would never let anyone define her again, not by what she wore, nor by their assumptions. As the evening wore on, Sophie felt herself starting to relax. The initial discomfort of being in such a lavish setting had faded, replaced with a quiet confidence. She moved through the crowd with Daniel, talking to guests, sharing stories about her charitable work, and finding herself engaged in real conversations for the first time in ages. There was something about being in this world, surrounded by people who didn't judge her, that made her feel like she finally belonged. But just as she was starting to feel at ease, a familiar voice broke through the calm. Well, well, if it isn't Mr. Reynolds and his charming wife. Sophie froze. She turned toward the voice, her heart sinking when she saw Victoria Parker, the woman from earlier, standing with a small group of guests. Victoria was one of the women who had cast those judgmental glances earlier in the night. She was impeccably dressed in a designer gown, her hair styled to perfection, and her smile was anything but warm. Victoria's gaze flicked from Sophie's face to her dress, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly before she met Daniel's eyes with a cool smile. "You didn't tell me you were bringing a new guest tonight, Daniel," Victoria said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm. "I must admit I'm surprised to see someone so unusual here. I thought this was a rather exclusive event." The group of guests around her tittered, their eyes shifting between Daniel and Sophie, clearly uncomfortable with the tension building in the air. Sophie felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to let Victoria's words shake her. She wasn't the woman she had been outside the boutique anymore. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the comment slide. He turned fully to face Victoria, his eyes sharp. "Victoria," Daniel said, his tone cool and measured. "Perhaps it's time you understand that people aren't defined by what they wear, or what you think they should wear." Victoria's expression flickered for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Oh, I'm sure," she replied, her voice laced with a hint of mockery. "But we both know how important appearances are in places like this, don't we?" Sophie could feel her temper rising at the implication, but before she could respond, Daniel stepped in front of her, his voice firm and unyielding. "You're right about one thing, Victoria. Appearances do matter, but what truly matters is what's inside, not the labels on the outside." Daniel's gaze swept over the small crowd that had gathered around them, the guests watching intently. "My wife, Sophie, is a woman of substance, and that's more than I can say for some people who think they can measure others by what they wear." Victoria's face turned pale as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. The guests around them were silent now, no longer laughing or whispering. Sophie could feel the shift in the room. It was as if the tide had turned, and the crowd was beginning to side with her, side with the truth. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're telling me that this—" She gestured at Sophie's simple dress with a dismissive flick of her hand. "This is what qualifies her for respect? How very quaint." Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm telling you, Victoria, that my wife has earned more respect in one day than you will ever earn in a lifetime. Not by her clothes, not by her wealth, but by the work she's done to better the world." Sophie could feel the eyes of everyone around them, the weight of their gaze heavy, but this time she stood tall. She stood next to Daniel, who was still speaking to Victoria with calm authority. "She's raised millions for children's education, built organizations from the ground up, and fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves," Daniel continued. "And if you can't see that, it's your loss, not hers." Victoria's smile faltered, her cheeks reddening slightly as her carefully constructed facade began to crack. The crowd, once tense and unsure, now shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, others nodded in approval of Daniel's words. "Perhaps you should take a moment to reflect on that," Daniel added, turning his attention back to Sophie. "Let's go, darling." He held out his hand to Sophie, and without a second thought she took it. She didn't care about Victoria or anyone else in that room anymore. As they turned to leave, the room seemed to quiet once again. But this time, there was no sneering, no judgment. Just a realization that Sophie wasn't the woman they had thought she was. As they made their way through the ballroom, the tension from the earlier confrontation seemed to hang in the air like a cloud. Sophie's mind raced, her thoughts still processing what had just happened. She could feel the eyes of the other guests following them as they walked. Some filled with curiosity, others with newfound respect. It was strange. She had always tried to blend into the background, to avoid being noticed, but now it seemed that everyone was watching. The weight of the night's events began to sink in, and Sophie realized that something profound had shifted. Daniel had stood up for her in front of an entire room of strangers, defending her not because of her appearance or wealth, but because of her character and accomplishments. She had never felt more seen, more valued. "Thank you," Sophie whispered to Daniel as they made their way toward the quieter side of the room. Her voice was filled with gratitude, but also something deeper, something she had never felt before: empowerment. Daniel smiled, his eyes soft as he glanced at her. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. You've always been worthy of respect. I just made sure they saw that." Sophie nodded, still trying to process everything. It was a lot to take in. The humiliation, the confrontation, the sudden shift in how people were looking at her. She had been dismissed for so long, but tonight, in a way she hadn't expected, she felt like she was finally standing in her own truth. Before they could settle into a conversation, a familiar voice called out from across the room, "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds." Sophie turned to see Elena, a woman she had met a few times through Daniel's business dealings, walking toward them with a bright smile. Elena was dressed in a glittering gold gown, and her elegance and poise immediately commanded attention. But unlike the others, Elena's gaze was warm, her eyes not filled with judgment but curiosity. "It's good to see you both," Elena said, her voice friendly and genuine. She turned her gaze to Sophie, her smile widening. "I must say, I didn't expect you to be here tonight, but I'm so glad to see you've joined us. I've heard wonderful things about the work you're doing with children's education. It's truly inspiring." Sophie blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in Elena's words. She hadn't expected to hear that kind of recognition here, of all places. "Thank you," Sophie said, her voice a little unsure at first. "I'm just trying to do what I can." Elena nodded, her expression softening. "No, you're doing a lot more than that. You're making a difference, and that's what matters. The world doesn't always see it, but people like you are the ones who change things for the better." Sophie felt the warmth of Elena's words settle over her like a blanket. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially from someone like Elena, who seemed to have everything: wealth, beauty, status. And yet, Elena wasn't looking at her like an outsider. She was looking at her with respect, with recognition. For the first time that evening, Sophie allowed herself to smile. A real smile, one that wasn't forced, one that didn't come from the need to prove something. It was the kind of smile that came from feeling proud of herself for the first time in years. As the night continued, Sophie found herself surrounded by more and more people who looked at her differently, not for the clothes she wore or the car she drove, but for who she was. The whispers had stopped. The judgment had faded. In its place, there was something new: respect. Sophie and Daniel mingled for the rest of the evening, their conversation light and easy. It felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. No longer did she feel like the invisible woman standing on the sidelines. No longer did she feel like she had to hide who she was or shrink in the presence of others. Tonight, she had learned something important. The only thing that could ever make her truly invisible was her own doubt. And with Daniel by her side, Sophie knew she would never let anyone dim her light again. As the evening came to a close, Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. The music still played in the background, the soft hum of conversations continuing around her. But the night had already transformed into something unforgettable. The glitzy, intimidating world that had once made her feel small had become a place of empowerment. Sophie no longer felt like the invisible woman in the room. She felt like someone who had earned her place. Daniel, sensing her shift in energy, leaned in close as they walked towards the exit. "Are you ready to go?" he asked, his voice calm, but Sophie could hear the pride in it. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Yes, I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady. She had never felt more certain of herself. As they stepped out of the luxurious hotel and into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling around them, Sophie felt a wave of relief. She had faced the judgments, the rejection, and the uncomfortable stares, but with Daniel's unwavering support, she had shown the world that she was more than the labels they tried to place on her. The car ride back was quiet but comfortable. Sophie sat back, her thoughts drifting over the events of the night. She thought about the way the saleswoman at the boutique had looked at her, the mockery she had endured, and how Daniel had turned the situation around. She thought about the conversation with Elena, the warm recognition in her eyes, and how it had felt to be seen for the first time. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, Daniel turned to her, his eyes soft with affection. "You were incredible tonight," he said, his words genuine and full of admiration. Sophie turned to him, her heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice sincere. "You showed me that I'm more than I thought I was. Tonight, I finally see myself for who I am, not who I thought I should be." Daniel smiled, a proud glint in his eyes. "You've always been that person, Sophie. You just needed to believe it." Sophie stepped out of the car, her feet touching the ground with a sense of strength she had never felt before. As she walked into their home, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The world outside could judge her all it wanted. It could try to define her by her appearance, her clothes, or her bank account. But none of that would matter anymore. She had learned the most important lesson of all. Her worth was never tied to how others saw her. It was about who she was on the inside, the work she did, and the love she gave. And from this moment on, she would never again allow anyone to make her feel small. As she and Daniel entered the house, Sophie knew that this was just the beginning. She had walked through a world of judgment and emerged stronger, more confident, and more sure of her place in it than ever before. And for the first time, Sophie felt truly free. Sophie's story is a powerful reminder that our worth is never determined by appearances or the opinions of others. If you've ever been judged based on what you wear or who you are, share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to join our community of story lovers. Let's keep sharing these moments of growth and transformation.